There's a moment that comes to everyone who's been trying to heal from something deep. A moment when you've done everything right, followed all the advice, put in the work, shown up day after day, and yet you still feel broken. You still wake up with that heaviness in your chest. You still carry the same wounds you've been carrying for months or years or decades. And in that moment, a terrible question forms in your mind. What if I can't heal from this? What if I'm the exception? What if some damage is just too deep, too old, too fundamental to who I am to ever truly mend? This is the moment when healing feels impossible. And here's what nobody tells you about that moment. It might be the most important part of your healing journey, not because you're doing something wrong, but because you're finally encountering the truth that changes everything. Let me tell you about a tree. In Japan, there's an ancient practice called kintsukuroi, which you might know by its more common name, kintsugi. It's the art of repairing broken pottery with gold, making the cracks visible rather than hiding them, turning the breaks into the most beautiful part of the object. But there's a lesser-known practice that relates to trees called kintsukuroi on living wood. When a tree in a sacred forest is damaged by lightning or disease or the simple violence of time, Japanese craftsmen don't try to hide the wound. They fill it with gold, making the scar the most radiant part of the tree. The tree continues to grow, continues to live, with gold running through its heartwood like veins of light. The damage becomes integrated into the tree's beauty rather than hidden or erased. Now, why am I telling you about trees and pottery when you're struggling with wounds that feel too deep to heal? Because I want you to understand something fundamental. Healing doesn't always mean going back to how you were before you were hurt. Sometimes healing means growing around the hurt. Sometimes it means the wound becomes part of your structure, part of your strength, filled with something precious rather than simply closed over and forgotten. And sometimes the moment when healing feels impossible is actually the moment when you stop trying to erase what happened to you and start learning to live as someone who survived it. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's start at the beginning, at the place where most people find themselves when they first realize they're hurt and need to heal. There's usually a moment of recognition, isn't there? Something breaks through the denial or the numbness or the busyness, and you suddenly see clearly, I'm not okay. This thing that happened to me, this loss or betrayal or trauma or gradual erosion of self, it's damaged me in ways I can't ignore anymore. That recognition feels both terrifying and hopeful. Terrifying because you're acknowledging real pain, but hopeful because acknowledgement feels like the first step toward change. So you start doing the work. Maybe you go to therapy. Maybe you read books about healing. Maybe you take up meditation or yoga or journaling. Maybe you cut out toxic people from your life. Maybe you start saying no, start setting boundaries, start choosing yourself for the first time in years. And for a while, it feels like progress. You have good days, you have moments of clarity and peace. You think, yes, this is working. I'm healing, I'm getting better. I can feel myself becoming whole again. And then you hit the wall. It happens differently for everyone, but it always happens. You wake up one morning and the old pain is back, just as sharp as ever, like no time has passed at all. Or you find yourself repeating a pattern you thought you'd broken. Or you encounter a trigger you thought you'd processed, and it knocks you flat all over again. Or maybe it's subtler than that. Maybe you just notice that despite all the work, despite all the effort, there's still this fundamental sense that something inside you is broken, and no amount of healing practices seems to touch it. This is the moment I'm talking about. This is when healing feels impossible, and this is where most healing advice falls tragically short, because most advice is predicated on the assumption that healing is a linear process. Do this, then this, then this, and you'll get better. Follow these steps and you'll reach wholeness. Put in the work and you'll be rewarded with peace. But that's not how healing actually works for most people, especially when the wounds run deep. Here's what's really happening in that moment when healing feels impossible. You're encountering the limits of what conventional healing can do for you. You're bumping up against the truth that some experiences change us in ways that can't be unchanged. Some things that happen to us become part of our story in such a fundamental way that trying to remove them would be like trying to unbake a cake. The ingredients have been transformed. The mixture has become something new. You can't separate the eggs back out from the flour. You can't return to the unmixed state. And this is where most people get stuck, because it feels like failure. If I can't heal back to who I was before, if the damage is permanent, then what's the point? What's the point of trying? What's the point of all this work if I'm never going to be fully whole again? But this is where that Japanese tree comes back into the story, because the tree with gold in its wound isn't less than it was before. It's different, certainly. It's been changed by what happened to it, but it's still alive. It's still growing, and the gold in its heartwood catches the light in ways that unblemished wood never could. Let me give you a human example of what I'm talking about. There's a writer named Sarah, and 15 years ago, her daughter died in a car accident. The child was 8 years old. For the first several years after the loss, Sarah tried everything to heal from the grief. Therapy, grief groups, medication, spiritual practices, throwing herself into work, retreating from work, moving to a new city, staying in the old apartment surrounded by memories, and nothing worked. The grief remained, this enormous presence in her life that colored everything, that made joy feel impossible, that turned every good moment into a reminder of what was missing. About 5 years after her daughter's death, Sarah had a breakdown. She told her therapist, "I've tried everything. I've done everything you're supposed to do, and I still wake up every single morning, and the first thought I have is that my daughter is dead. I'm never going to heal from this. It's impossible." And her therapist said something that changed everything. She said, "What if you're right? What if you're never going to heal back to who you were before? What if the goal isn't to stop feeling the loss, but to learn to live a full life while still carrying it?" That question broke something open in Sarah. Or maybe it broke something closed. She stopped trying to heal in the way she'd been conceptualizing healing. She stopped trying to reach a day when she'd wake up and not think about her daughter. Instead, she started asking, how do I build a life that has room for this grief? How do I create meaning and joy and connection while still honoring this permanent ache in my heart? And slowly, not linearly, not perfectly, but slowly, she found a way. She started a scholarship fund in her daughter's name. She began writing about grief in a way that helped other bereaved parents. She learned to feel joy again without feeling guilty about it. She fell in love again. She created a life that was different from the one she'd imagined, but it was still a life with a wound filled with gold. Now, I want to be very careful here, because I don't want to romanticize pain or suggest that suffering is beautiful or that you should be grateful for the things that hurt you. That's not what I'm saying. The wound isn't good. The tree would rather not have been struck by lightning. Sarah would give anything to have her daughter back. The pottery would prefer to have never been broken. The damage is real, and the loss is real, and the pain is real. But given that the damage has happened, given that the wound exists, there's a choice about what to do with it. The conventional healing model says, work to close the wound, work to make the damage invisible, work to return to the pre-injured state. And for some wounds, for some people, that model works perfectly. A broken bone heals, a physical injury closes. Some emotional hurts fade with time and processing until they barely leave a mark. But for the deep wounds, for the ones that change the structure of who you are, that model often leads to this moment of impossible healing. Because you're trying to achieve something that's fundamentally unattainable, and every day you don't reach it feels like failure. But there's another model, the Kintsu Kuroi model, that says acknowledge the wound, honor what it cost you, and then integrate it into who you are now in a way that creates meaning rather than just pain. This model doesn't ask you to be grateful for the damage. It doesn't ask you to say, everything happens for a reason, or it made me stronger, or any of those phrases that can feel like violence when you're really hurting. It just asks you to recognize that since the wound exists, since you can't undo what was done, you have some choice about how you carry it forward. Let me give you another example, this one more common. Think about someone who grew up with a parent who was emotionally unavailable, or critical, or abusive. That person spends their adult life trying to heal from their childhood. They read about attachment theory and inner child work. They go to therapy and work through memories and practice self-compassion. And they make progress, real progress. They learn to recognize their patterns. They learn to set boundaries. They learn to choose healthier relationships. But still, after all that work, there's something in them that flinches when someone gets too close. There's still a voice in their head that sounds like that critical parent. There's still a wound that didn't heal cleanly, that left scar tissue that affects how they move through the world. And they reach this moment. I've done so much work. Why am I still like this? Why can't I just be normal? Why can't I just trust people the way people who had good parents seem to trust? Why is healing taking so long? Why isn't it working? And the answer might be because you're trying to become someone who never experienced what you experienced. You're trying to heal back to a version of yourself that never existed, a version that had the childhood you needed instead of the childhood you had. And that's impossible, not because you're failing at healing, but because you're pursuing a destination that doesn't exist. But here's what is possible. You can become someone who knows what it's like to not have your needs met as a child and has learned to meet your own needs as an adult. You can become someone who understands trust issues intimately because you lived through trust being broken and who chooses carefully who to trust as a result. You can become someone whose empathy for other wounded people runs deep precisely because you know what those wounds feel like from the inside. The damage doesn't disappear. The history doesn't change, but the relationship to it can transform. This is where we need to talk about something that's rarely discussed in healing conversations, the concept of functional wholeness versus nostalgic wholeness. Nostalgic wholeness is the fantasy of returning to some earlier state before you were hurt, before you knew what you now know, before the world revealed its capacity for pain. It's the idea that healing means becoming that innocent, undamaged version of yourself again. But for most deep wounds, nostalgic wholeness is impossible because that earlier self no longer exists and cannot be recovered. Functional wholeness, on the other hand, is about being able to live a full, meaningful, connected life with the wounds you carry. It's about the wound no longer controlling your entire existence. It's about being able to choose your actions rather than being driven by your pain. It's about the difference between I am my trauma and I am someone who experienced trauma. That shift might seem subtle, but it's everything. It's the difference between the wound being your entire identity and the wound being one part of your complex, multifaceted story. When healing feels impossible, what's often really happening is you're grieving the loss of nostalgic wholeness. You're finally confronting the reality that you can't go back. You can't undo what was done. You can't become the person you would have been if the hurt had never happened. And that's a real loss that deserves to be grieved. It's okay to be sad about it. It's okay to be angry about it. It's okay to acknowledge that something was taken from you that you'll never get back. That's not the same as being stuck in victimhood. It's just honest recognition of reality. But once you've grieved the impossibility of nostalgic wholeness, you can start building toward functional wholeness. And this is where the real work begins. The work that feels less like healing in the conventional sense and more like integration, like alchemy, like making something new from the broken pieces rather than trying to restore the original. So what does this actually look like in practice? What do you do when healing feels impossible? First, you acknowledge the truth of what you're feeling. You stop gaslighting yourself with toxic positivity. You stop telling yourself that if you just tried harder, or believed more, or practiced better, you'd be fixed by now. You look at the reality. I'm hurt. I've been doing the work, and I'm still hurt. That's the truth. That's where I am, and that's okay. It doesn't mean you're broken beyond repair. It means you're encountering the limits of a particular model of healing, and you need a different approach. Second, you get specific about what impossible healing actually means for you. What is it you're trying to heal that feels impossible? Often, when we drill down, we find that what feels impossible is returning to a state of innocence or ignorance or ease that existed before the hurt. And of course, that's impossible. You can't unknow what you know. You can't unexperience what you experienced. But you can heal into wisdom. You can heal into consciousness. You can heal into a kind of strength that only comes from having been broken and having survived. Third, you start asking different questions. Instead of, how do I make this pain go away? You ask, how do I build a meaningful life with this pain as part of my landscape? Instead of, why can't I get over this? You ask, what am I learning from carrying this? Instead of, when will I finally be healed? You ask, what does wholeness look like for me now, given what I've experienced? These questions don't offer easy answers, but they point toward a path that's actually walkable, unlike the path that leads toward impossible nostalgic wholeness. Fourth, you start practicing integration rather than elimination. You stop trying to cut out the wounded parts of yourself and start learning to hold them with compassion. You stop dividing yourself into healed and still broken and start recognizing that you're a whole person who contains multitudes, including both strength and vulnerability, both wisdom and woundedness. The Kintsukuroi tree doesn't reject the lightning-struck part of itself. It integrates it, surrounds it with gold, and keeps growing. And fifth, you give yourself permission to redefine what healing means for you. Maybe healing doesn't mean never thinking about what hurt you. Maybe it means thinking about it without being destroyed by it. Maybe healing doesn't mean never trusting everyone. Maybe it means being able to trust the right people while protecting yourself from the wrong ones. Maybe healing doesn't mean never having a bad day. Maybe it means having bad days that don't erase all your progress, that don't send you spiraling back to the beginning, that you can move through and come out the other side. There's a concept in Japanese aesthetics called wabi-sabi, the idea of finding beauty in imperfection, in impermanence, in incompleteness, a cracked teacup, an asymmetrical flower arrangement, a weathered fence. There's a recognition in this philosophy that perfection is not only impossible, but also less interesting, less real, less human than the imperfect beauty of things that have lived and been marked by that living. And I think we need a wabi-sabi approach to healing, an approach that recognizes that the healed version of you doesn't have to be perfect or unblemished or identical to who you were before you were hurt. The healed version of you can be scarred and weathered and asymmetrical and still be beautiful, still be whole, still be enough. When Sarah, the mother who lost her daughter, finally found her way toward functional wholeness, she said something that stayed with me. She said, "I used to think healing meant reaching a day when I didn't hurt anymore. Now I understand that healing means reaching a day when the hurt no longer prevents me from living." She still misses her daughter every single day. The grief is still there, will always be there, but it's no longer the only thing there. It's no longer the thing that makes every other experience impossible. She's built a life large enough to contain both the grief and the joy, both the loss and the love, both the wound and the gold. That's what's possible when healing feels impossible. Not the erasure of pain, but the expansion of your capacity to hold it alongside everything else. Not the return to innocence, but the development of wisdom. Not the restoration of what was broken, but the creation of something new from the pieces. The wound becomes part of your story, but not the entirety of your story. The scar becomes visible, maybe even prominent, but it's surrounded by gold, by meaning, by everything you've learned and become through the process of surviving. And here's the thing about functional wholeness. It's not a destination you reach and then maintain forever. It's more like a practice, something you return to again and again, something that deepens and evolves as you do. You'll have periods where you feel integrated and whole, and you'll have periods where the old wound aches and you feel broken all over again. That's not failure. That's not sliding backward. That's just the reality of being a complex human being with a history that includes both beauty and pain. The wound doesn't heal linearly. It heals in spirals. You'll think you've dealt with something, and then it'll come back around at a deeper level, asking to be integrated more fully, asking to teach you something new. And each time it comes around, you have the opportunity to meet it with a little more wisdom, a little more compassion, a little more skill at holding it without being consumed by it. The goal isn't to reach a point where it never comes back. The goal is to get better at the dance, to learn the steps, to know that you can move through it and come out intact on the other side. So if you're in that moment right now, if healing feels impossible, if you've been doing the work and still hurting and wondering what's wrong with you, I want you to know, nothing is wrong with you. You're not failing. You're not the exception. You're not broken beyond repair. You're just encountering the limits of a healing model that doesn't account for the reality of deep wounds. You're just being asked to expand your definition of what healing can look like. You're just being invited to stop trying to return to who you were and start becoming who you're meant to be now after everything you've experienced. The tree with gold in its heartwood is not less than other trees. It's different. It carries a story in its wood that other trees don't carry. And maybe that's true for you too. Maybe the goal isn't to be like people who were never hurt the way you were hurt. Maybe the goal is to be fully yourself, which includes both the hurt and everything you've become through learning to live with it. Maybe the impossible healing you're seeking is impossible because it's the wrong kind of healing, and the possible healing, the real healing, the healing that will actually work for you, is waiting just on the other side of accepting that you don't have to be who you were before. You just have to be who you are now, scars and all, wounds and all, with room for both the pain and the beauty, both the grief and the joy, both the damage and the gold. That kind of healing doesn't feel impossible. It feels hard, yes. It feels like work, absolutely. But it doesn't feel impossible because it's not asking you to achieve the unachievable. It's just asking you to be human, to be real, to be honest about what you carry, and compassionate about how you carry it. And that, despite everything, despite all the pain and all the years and all the ways you've been broken, that is possible. That is always possible. One day at a time, one breath at a time, one choice to fill your wounds with gold and keep growing toward the light.